How is everybody? Yay, all right. Nice and early. My name is Andrea Aldana. I'm the Director of Housing Advocacy at the Community Development Partnership, where we help people live, work, and thrive on the Lower Cape. Welcome to our session, Getting from NIMBY to YIMBY. Who here can tell me what NIMBY stands for? Not in my backyard. So what does YIMBY stand for? Yes, in my backyard. So YIMBY is actually a term that organized groups are using across the country, in fact, to signify their pro-housing position and to advocate for housing initiatives in their communities. So you can actually plug into the YIMBY community. There is, I think the most active YIMBY group is in Boston, right? Jesse's group?
Yeah, Better Cambridge.
Better Cambridge, yeah. And so there's actually a conference, an annual conference called YIMBY Town. This past fall, it was in Boston, and the year before that, it was in Oakland, California. I don't know where it's going to be next, but if you want to get plugged in, you should probably look that up, and they have a listserv that you can join and learn about what's going on across the country. So before we get started, my colleagues are going to introduce themselves. I'm joined by Dave Quinn from Housing Assistance Corporation.
Good morning, everyone. Dave Quinn, Housing Assistance Corporation. I'm the Director of Housing Development. For those of you who don't know, HACK, as we go by, although I don't like that acronym, is a nonprofit organization on the Cape that focuses on a whole spectrum of housing issues. So anywhere from homelessness, we have several homeless shelters, all the way up to building our own housing. We do energy audits, we manage Section 8 rental vouchers, and we also are a housing developer, so we kind of cover the whole spectrum of housing.
And I'm Stephanie Cox. I'm a private consultant. My business is Nexus Works. And having worked for a broad variety of local elected officials at the state and federal level, I started my business because I wanted people who couldn't afford a lobbyist to be able to learn how to engage in the process without getting overwhelmed or giving up. So I designed a line of advocacy training programs, both for nonprofits and for their members and civic groups, et cetera. And has been my pleasure to work with Andrea and with David on developing the advocacy training for that we just wrapped up. You guys are sort of capstone to this. It's fun when friends walk through the door. Also been working with David and I co-authored this paper, Housing on Cape Cod, The High Cost of Doing Nothing, which I encourage you all to take a look at, and have been working also as an advocate for better accessory dwelling unit bylaws that will make it easier for homeowners to build and rent out in-law apartments, which adds to the supply of small 1- and 2-bedroom units that are year-round on the Cape without developing open space. Which is up for consideration in 5 town meetings this spring. So I encourage you to find out if they're in yours and just come and support them. Thanks.
All right, so the goal of this session is to help you shift from supporting housing kind of philosophically, ideologically, to actually helping you be an advocate to move the needle on addressing the housing crisis. So that's the point of this session, and hopefully that's all what you want to do. So I feel like as a region, we have pretty much all come to the understanding that there is a housing crisis on Cape Cod. And if you disagree, we can totally have that debate later. But what you may not know is that the housing crisis isn't just affecting people at low incomes or extremely low incomes, although there certainly continues to be a need there. The housing crisis is affecting people with moderate incomes, people who you would consider to have really good paying jobs. So if you live on Cape Cod, and you have a great job that pays really well, you probably still have a really hard time finding a place to live, and that's assuming you can even find some place that's available year-round, right? And that's actually not unique to Cape Cod. That's a national trend, and it's something that's being felt acutely on the Outer and Lower Cape, and it's increasingly going to be felt across the Cape within the next 10 years. And we have data on that from the Cape Cod Commission's recent housing market study, so that's homework for all of you if you haven't already read that. It's only like 300 pages. But the good news is that there's really no mystery about how to solve this crisis. We know exactly what needs to be done, and in fact, there are a lot of people working really hard to deal with this, but it's gonna take a lot of energy and a lot of advocacy from people like yourselves to actually move the needle. So today what we're gonna do is we're gonna talk a little bit about what the housing challenge is, And then we're going to talk about what is being done about it and what you can do about it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to David Quinn to talk about the challenge.
Excellent. So as Andrea mentioned, that we've started to notice a sort of a difference in the type of people that are coming through our door at Housing Assistance Corporation. Typically, we focus more on the lower income individuals, again, Section 8 vouchers, homelessness. But within the last year or two, we started noticing more and more people who are stably employed coming through our door, who've been stably housed, coming through our door and saying, I've been in a place for 10 years, I've had no problem paying the rent, all of a sudden the owner is selling the place. And so we really wanted to look into that. Steph and I, we hired Steph to kind of come in and help us analyze that situation, figure out what was going on in the market, try to pull together as many reports as we could. You mentioned there's a lot of great reports out there. The Cape Cod Commission has an excellent report on housing that you can look at. It's several hundred pages long, I think. Every town has sort of their own housing production plan. We wanted to create...
Ours is shorter, and it has pictures.
It has pictures. We wanted to create something that kind of pulled all that together and made it really accessible for people to read. And also, honestly, our target was trying to get at people who maybe don't think about this issue. Maybe you already have your house, maybe you already have a second home. But we wanted to drive home the fact that this is going to affect everyone. It's an economic issue, not a housing issue. So that's really what we tried to drive home. And I think the big takeaway for us as an organization was to realize that we needed to start looking at this as a bigger issue of housing supply.
And one of the other key objectives, too, was so many reports focus on the problem or focus on solutions, or other ones independently focus on impacts, but nothing was really tying it together. And we wanted a really clear picture, really crisp picture of what are the problems, what are the barriers, what is it impacting, how is it impacting our economy, and then what can we do about it? So kind of putting it all together in one package.
Exactly. I mean, and this is just not just a Cape Cod thing. This is an issue in all of Massachusetts. We have a quote here from Charlie Baker, the governor, addressing this issue of it being a housing supply issue generally. So we need to look at how we can add housing supply at all income levels.
Yeah, and we really found that when it comes to supply, I mean, part of it is when you look at our seasonal economy, that is creating shifts in the existing supply. So for example, we found from 2005 to 2015 that there was a drop of 3,000 year-round housing units and a spike of 5,000 seasonal units. So that if it seems harder to find a year-round place, it's because it is. But also, you know, we also just have to recognize there's more people living in our country, that, you know, there's more people alive than there were 50 or 100 years ago. There's more people wanting to live on the Cape. And, you know, it's a desirable place to live. So we need to look at how, you know, the basic economics of why it's so expensive for us as young professionals is because there's a dwindling supply, you know, and as soon as you tighten that supply, then the price goes up. It's basic economics. So we need to find a way to add to the supply of year-round housing.
Exactly. And so we're going to present some solutions tonight, but before we could get to that, we have to kind of talk about what are the barriers to more housing. So part of the report was looking at what are all the major things that are preventing more housing supply. And really at the top of our list, what we found was zoning. I know this isn't always an exciting topic to talk about, but it is really important when you're talking about housing development and what you can actually build and where you can build it. So it's just the zoning is just sort of what the regulations that overlay land use and what you can do on any given parcel, the height, how many units, what it has to look like. And we found on the Cape that pretty much the only thing you can build is single family homes. And typically it takes 1 to 2 acres of land to do that. So that's about the size of a football field. We have a nice graphic in the paper about showing a football field. You need a football field to build a house on Cape Cod. So that doesn't fit everyone's needs, and it really incentivizes that second home. So if you're a builder and you're looking for, even though there is this demand for sort of 1 and 2 bedroom apartments or studios, if you're a builder and you're trying to figure out where to direct your resources, you can build single family homes by right. You don't need to go in for any kind of special permitting. Whereas if you're trying to build multifamily, except for some places in downtown areas, it's very difficult to do that, and there's a lot of uncertainty. So we saw that as a very large barrier to creating more housing. Second would be wastewater. To build at the densities that we need wastewater, and it's very, very expensive. But to build, again, to build at the scale that we need to build, and to do it in a really compact way, in downtown areas, we need more wastewater infrastructure. Steph mentioned the seasonal economy. Obviously, it's a huge driver of the housing market on the Cape. We have locals competing with off-Cape buyers for their second homes. So really, the housing market is driven by money coming from off-Cape. So in a competition for homes, you're not going to, the year-round home buyer is going to lose out most of the time. And most of that seasonal housing stock is sitting vacant. We know there's 60,000 seasonal homes on Cape Cod. 72% of them are vacant for more than half of the year. So we have this housing stock just kind of sitting there.
And one other thing that we also found that the commission had done some great research on is Barnstable County, 30, 40 years ago they had families. They had 3 to 4 people per house, right? An efficient use of bedrooms in a home. Today, it's 1 to 2. It's seniors living by themselves. If we're not properly utilizing those bedrooms, like through allowing accessory dwelling units to be built or allowing collaborative living spaces like, the Golden Girls. If we're not allowing that, we're creating the demand for more development. So one of the things that we're really sensitive to as authors of this report, and for me as someone who grew up here and whose family has been here for 14 generations, I don't want to see the Cape become, suburbia. I don't want to see the Cape become overdeveloped. I don't want to see the culture of the Cape change, but I also don't want to lose the character of the Cape, which is you. And so one of the things that we try to weave in here as much as possible is that it's possible to do both. And, we've had missed opportunities over the years. Back in the 80s, there was federal grant money to fix our wastewater problem, and we didn't take it because of fear of density. And had we done that, we could have created the level of density as small 1 and 2 bedroom units in our downtown villages where it's appropriate. And then we could have increased the amount of zoning and decreased the amount of sprawl everywhere else and had much more of a thoughtful development of the rest of Cape Cod. We missed that boat. If we had passed, what is now the Cape Cod Commission's model bylaw, making it easier for homeowners to build and rent out accessory dwelling units in the 90s, we would have hundreds, if not thousands, of little 1 and 2 bedroom units sprinkled throughout the Cape, not developing any more land. So there are opportunities we've missed, but it doesn't, and that doesn't mean it's in conflict with open space preservation. It doesn't mean it's in conflict with the environment or with community character. And I think that's a really important takeaway, is that housing does not live in conflict with those things.
Great points. The last two, so the first 3 are sort of the more actionable things, and then the last 2 are sort of things that are just sort of inherent with the fact, with where we are. We have land prices very high. Obviously, a lot of Cape Cod is already developed or under conservation. That's a great thing. 80% of Cape Cod is already developed or protected. So that really limits the remaining amount of land available to develop. And we don't necessarily want to develop. We're not necessarily advocating cutting down more trees, more areas that could be, protected area. Protected area. Is it off?
Your mic stopped working.
Hello? Great.
You sound great.
Thank you. How's that? Hello?
Tire shutdown.
Alrighty. All right. So land prices are high, and then also cost of construction is very high as well. At HAC, with the recent construction projects have been coming in well over $300 a square foot for development. So the cost to build just 1 unit of housing can be over $300,000.
You have a sense of how many units we are short?
That is a good question. Yeah, so it's a lot, and so it's what's that? 26,000 was that, so that it kind of depends how you look at it. So there was a Cape Cod Commission report that kind of looked at this issue and said we're 26,000 units short to get to a point where housing is affordable for everyone, or to fill the affordability for everyone, essentially, I think.
Well, I think the way that they're framing it is it's a nebulous target,
Exactly,
right?
exactly.
But the way that they're framing it is that if there are 26,000 units available on the market right now, they would be eaten up immediately. If people
Right.
could actually access them.
Right.
But they did also say that for seniors, that, as I mentioned before, you have one person living in a 4-bedroom house that doesn't have a lot of options in terms of being able to downsize. If seniors had better options for being able to downsize, the commission estimates that we could fill 1/3 of that need with the existing homes here. So we need to be thinking about how to repurpose and use our existing housing stock.
And this is a conversation, it's working now. This is a conversation we've been having a lot because it's such a big number. We really just feel like we have to attack kind of all areas. So, sort of the low-hanging fruit, and we have programs we're trying to convert existing housing stock into year-round housing, which can be done quicker and at smaller scale, and then while we're also working on these larger issues of wastewater and zoning and really long-term planning that can actually have a huge impact on the ability to build more housing. So it's a good question.
That always goes the wrong way. All right, solutions.
All right, so before we tell you what you can do about it, we're going to tell you a little bit about what is already being done about it. So obviously, this is a really complicated problem, and it's going to require a holistic approach. And it's really important to me because I've been talking to so many people who kind of feel like this problem has its own personality, it's running away from us, there's nothing we can do about it, there's a sense of hopelessness, and when you feel hopeless, you do nothing, right? And so that's definitely not something that we want you to leave with. We want you to understand that there is tons that we can do, and a lot of people are working really hard. And so the Cape Community Housing Partnership is a program developed by the Community Development Partnership and Housing Assistance Corporation. It started a couple of years ago, and the purpose of it is to increase the capacity of towns to meet the housing needs of their residents. And it came from an understanding that, as Dave mentioned before, there are land use issues that need to be resolved. We need infrastructure. These are big, complicated decisions that are being made by people who are very well-intentioned volunteers. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they have the skills and knowledge to make the best decisions that will really solve the housing problem. So the Cape Community Housing Partnership is a holistic, three-pronged approach to get at it from different angles. And the first is through a Cape Housing Institute, and this is for municipal officials. Again, understanding that they are volunteers and they need to be educated so that they can have the tools to solve the housing crisis. And so this is a free 6-week training that we've been offering for 2 years now. We'll continue to offer it annually. It's for people who are directly involved in housing decision-making, so select board, finance committee, planning board, zoning board, community preservation committee. There's a long list of people who we invite every year. And they're coming. We've trained over 100 different municipal officials from across the Cape. They meet quarterly to talk about these issues in a sub-regional level. They're going to advanced trainings. They're working really hard. The second thing is an advocacy training, and this is what Stephanie has helped us with this year. So the advocacy training is really where you come in, because municipal officials can work really hard all day long, but Cape Cod, most towns on the Cape, not all towns, most towns have town meeting. So this is the closest we're going to get to direct democracy, people, which means that you actually get to decide what happens in your communities. And if you're not showing up to support these housing initiatives, then municipal officials really can only get so far, right? So you are a really critical piece of this puzzle. And then the third piece is a media campaign, which is right here. We launched this campaign less than 2 weeks ago, Britt. So the purpose of this campaign is to show the true face of people who live in or need housing. There are a lot of myths and stereotypes around who requires housing to stay on the Cape, and they're just not true. So here we're featuring, in our first phase, we're featuring a medical assistant in Harwich, a firefighter in Wellfleet, and a teacher in Orleans. And these are people who are a really important piece of the community fabric, right? We don't have a community without these kinds of people. So you can see our ads in more detail over on the right, and we'll be continuing to roll out other profiles over the coming months. So we'll know that we've succeeded in addressing the housing crisis, not unilaterally, when there is broad public support for housing, including affordable housing. Notice that we're not just talking about affordable housing, we're talking about housing for people at all income levels. We'll also know that we've succeeded when towns implement changes in their zoning laws, when there's an increase in the number of affordable units on the town's subsidized housing inventory. And if you're really interested to learn more about housing, it's good to know what the subsidized housing inventory is. Without getting into too much detail, basically, it's a list that's managed by the state that tracks the number of affordable units in a town, and so towns are always working to increase that number. And so when you hear about this minimum goal of 10%, the way that they're tracking that 10% is through this subsidized housing inventory, or the SHI list, as some people call it. And then we'll also be really happy to see lots of towns increasing the Community Preservation Act funding that they allocate toward community housing. So you can learn more about CPA on your own, but it is a really important local tool that towns can, it's local funds, right? So towns can have more control over housing development by allocating their own funds. And there's a minimum of 10% that all towns have to allocate towards community housing, but it doesn't have to be just 10%. Steph, I think in Cambridge they increased it to 20%. I'm not sure. I feel like that's true, but don't quote me. It is. So towns can certainly be using more than the minimum toward housing. Now let's talk about what to do about it.
All right, so we already talked about a couple of these. Zoning reform, obviously we're advocating for people to get out there and know what's going on in terms of zoning in their towns. Again, I know that's not the most exciting thing. You want to get amped up to go to a planning board meeting. Some of us do, but yes. So we're trying to encourage towns to, we're not telling towns where they should develop housing or where they should, should open up more areas for multifamily development, since every town has a planning office, planning board. These are really local decisions, but we're trying to encourage towns to think of where places in their towns where this would be appropriate, and to make that by right. So developers get the signal that this is where the town wants you to build. Steph, do you want to say anything more about ADUs, or you good?
I think I've covered that.
Okay, we talked about wastewater. Obviously, we need to be encouraging more wastewater investment on the Cape. That's a big expense, and there's a lot of momentum right now on the Cape around wastewater, so that's great. We're also looking at ways to convert our existing housing stock. On your way in, you might have seen this postcard at the table back there. We're trying to be creative. At HAC, we started a new program called Rent 365. We're actually paying people who are second homeowners $1,000 if they're willing to, instead of renting it out weekly, to rent it out year-round. So if it's vacant, if maybe it's in a home that's in your family that you haven't used in a while, if you would rent it out year-round, we'll give you $1,000. We'll help you rent it up, give you a lease, kind of walk you through the process. And our goal is 25 units in the first year. We have about 16 that have been converted. So that's not a lot. It's not going to solve the problem on its own. But when you think about how much it costs to build one unit, that's something that we can really, we can take small steps on. And then I think the other big one is that we have this opportunity coming up with the short-term rental tax, where towns are, so the short-term rental tax is now going to tax short-term rentals. So towns are going to have a large amount of money available to them. We're not sure exactly how much yet. We're really encouraging towns to set that money aside for housing, for wastewater. Put it in a special fund. We have a program called Future Cape Cod.
Yep. So Future Cape Cod is a coalition of the Cape Cod Chamber of Commerce, of Association to Preserve Cape Cod, of the Realtors Association, and HAC. And we have an open letter at futurecapecod.com that I encourage everyone to sign. And it asks towns to set aside this new money for long-term investments, things we've always said that we need to invest in, but the choice was always to kick the can down the road or to solve the problem on the backs of taxpayers. By setting this new money aside before we even really sort of get used to having it in your budget. It's like if you get a raise and you put it all just into your regular everyday budget, you get used to having it. And then you're not doing necessarily some of the long-term things like fixing the roof that you need to do as if you had put it away in a savings account. So we're advocating putting it away in what's called a stabilization account. We created a model bylaw, and we're asking every town on the Cape to consider taking it up over the course of the next year, because saying if you just put this money aside, you decide how to spend it, when to spend it, but we're asking it to be set aside for long-term projects. Yeah. Yep, and basically we're projecting that most towns are going to at least double the amount of lodging tax revenue that they have been getting.
Did any more questions? Yeah.
I was just wondering, when you're talking about ways to increase your housing, has there been any investigation on, and I have no idea how this would work, I just see in our neighborhood, as soon as an older person moves away, that house automatically ends up as a summer rent.
Yep.
Is there any way to come up with an incentive, so when a house is sold, it's sold for year round? I have no idea how that would work, but it just seems like as soon as the older person dies or moves into assisted living, that house in our neighborhood automatically goes away.
Yeah, I mean, and you're not you're not wrong in that perception. That is absolutely what's happening. So I think that you just actually you skipped ahead because we're well. So solution-wise, I mean, I'm not sure structurally how we could make something like that work and legally, but that's something for us to consider. But in terms of framing, which is what one of the things we're going to talk about in my next session on the advocacy training piece, you just right there framed it as what we've been really trying to get across. You know, when people say no in my backyard, when they say no to housing, no to zoning changes, no to accessory dwelling units, no to affordable housing, they come from it from a premise that if I just say no, everything will stay the same. What we have been trying to get people to understand is that that's not a real choice. That doesn't exist. Things are changing around us. What you see happening in terms of your neighborhood changing and having less lights on in the winter has a deleterious effect on your neighborhood. Yeah, exactly. And that hurts our sense of community. It also hurts our ability as an economy to meet the needs of the year-round residents. Because if you can't have workers who are locally, self-contained, locally housed, then it costs the businesses more in order to ship them in from over the bridge or from elsewhere. And then that cost gets passed on to consumers. So that's one of the big messages in our report, is that the cost of doing nothing is that those of us who are left are going to pay more for goods and services. We're going to have decreased access to essential services. We've got an entire generation of baby boomers aging. Who's going to take care of them? When CNA gets paid $15 an hour and lives on the other side of the bridge, she's not going to sit in traffic in the middle of the summer for 3 hours to go to Orleans for a 3 or 4 hour shift, particularly when there are seniors aging on her side of the bridge. So what does this mean for our economy? What does this mean for traffic? When you've got a quarter of your workforce right now, a quarter of our year-round workforce is coming from over the bridge right now. What happens when that gets to 50? What happens when that gets to 75? In addition to all the tourists coming here in the summer. It's not going to be pretty. So the cost of doing nothing is high. So we're going to talk about framing. When you're getting involved in advocacy, we're also going to talk about just knowing your audience and how to engage. And this is on the municipal level, but a lot of this goes for other venues. And then we're going to talk about kind of how to bring it all together in an elevator speech. Who here loves public speaking? Say it loud and proud. Christina. Of course. When we developed this, we actually both have kind of lamented how neither of us really love it, but we've gotten into it. Can I help you? Yes.
Hi, my name's Dave Cantor. I'm the Provincetown Town Manager.
Oh, Dave, welcome. Thank you for coming. We're happy to have you.
Yeah, no, thank you. I just want to say to everybody here, everything they're saying is excellent, and these are not theoreticals. Provincetown's done pretty much every single thing on this list, and you see the power of land value and second homeowner, because in spite of doing this, our recent analysis is that we need to have 305 housing units built in the next 8 years just to stay where we are today in 2019. The idea that the person over there had about the neighborhood changing, that's doable. You could create a municipal covenant that would be paid to the owners to create a restriction on the unit prior to sale that could say you pay a person $20,000. I'm talking on a $750,000 home, $500,000 home. You could do this. Municipalities could do this, and they could put a covenant that would say for a year, let's say, after the person passes, it's going to be marketed a certain way. That's doable. But I want to point out one thing, and it's going to come up in one of the later sessions. It is only entirely doable if you show up to town meeting. You will all be there too. I will be there hopefully. But for right now, for where you're at, everything they're saying has to happen, and frankly, it all comes down to participation at your local level that makes these policies happen. They're all good policies. Thank you.
Thank you. We're so, you just said it, and you are kind of my spirit animal today. Julie, and then one more question.
About Provincetown is one of the 6 that's potentially bringing something to town meeting, or you can say 5 or 6.
I don't think you guys are doing the ADUs this.
Oh, no, we already did, we have ADUs, but pretty much right. If I may?
Yeah.
Okay, look, there's a problem with ADUs. Right now, in my opinion, I've looked across the entire country. The only part of the country that are really successful right now is Portland, Oregon, and I'm trying to study it for why. At least for Provincetown, it's not so true elsewhere. If you have a home that's $750,000 median income, do you really want some stranger that you don't know living in your backyard? We make it as of right, and we have only 3 units in town. The problem with ADUs as a model is finding a way to make it a realistic incentive. We even provide you the residential tax exemption, which is 25% if you rent to someone year round. It was up on Dave's slide. We provide that. That was a special act. They gave it to Provincetown. I think they give it to other Cape towns. And it's still not effective. I think it's an all of the above menu, but I think it's a challenge with ADUs.
Yeah, our whole thing with ADUs is it's not a silver bullet, and our whole message in our report is that there is no silver bullet, and we are not going to solve this problem overnight. We're not going to be one and done, and yep, we fixed housing. It is pushing all the levers at the same time to keep us from going over a cliff where no one can afford to live here. So accessory dwelling units, yeah, are one way. But if someone builds them because they've got a family member, and that family member, mother-in-law, passes away, then that's an opportunity to rent that out year-round. And right now, we make it very difficult for that homeowner to do that. So I don't want to spend too much time on that. I want to talk a little bit more about the actual advocacy. And when you're engaging in the process, local elected officials, any kind of elected or appointed officials, they have to represent a broad constituency. So it's always helpful that when you're framing something, it's not just about, it's important to have your personal story, but it's also important to frame it in terms of how this is impacting a large number of constituents so that they are responding to the needs of the totality of their constituency. So statistics can be really helpful when it comes to that. Personal stories, from business types to illustrate a larger point of how this is bad for the business community. And then there's the good old what's in it for me. How does this make the decision makers look good? So these are things to kind of keep in mind. So framing housing. What we did in this report, High Cost of Doing Nothing, was, I went over this a little bit, but we said that when we're reframing housing, it's not just a matter of, sticking our heads in the sand, doing nothing, and everything staying the same. These things are all going to be affected. Last week we had a Cape Cod Times story followed by a Boston Globe story asking where are all the children of the Outer Cape? Because their parents can't afford to live there. It costs in Wellfleet $550,000 for just a regular Cape house. And in Barnstable, right now I think it's about $370, but Cape-wide, the median housing price, brace yourselves, in 2025 is going to be between $600,000 and $700,000. How are we, the young professionals of this community, supposed to start with that as an entry point? So where are all the kids going to be? And that framing and that message and the need for lights on, as you mentioned, is exactly how we start changing from NIMBY to YIMBY. So you use your framing in terms of, how this affects a broad constituency. You use generally talking points that, everyone please make sure that you sign up the email sign-up sheet that is either going around or in the back of the room. Because we can let you know either through Hack CDP or Smarter Cape, which is my other client where we work on the accessory dwelling unit. We can let you know when an issue is coming up in your town. We can provide you with talking points and make the process as easy as possible for you. But then you get to integrate it into an elevator speech. Who can define that for me? Yeah, it's what you can say from the 10th floor to the first floor if you were stuck in the elevator with the decision maker. Absolutely. So it's, when you get up and you speak, say, at a public hearing or at town meeting or in a one-on-one conversation or even in an email with an elected or appointed official, you want to first up just identify yourself as a constituent. That's important because, as much as the Falmouth Board of Selectmen may be interested in what I have to say, if I'm not a resident of the town, it's not going to carry the same weight. So identifying yourself and giving that kind of one-line preview. I'd love to talk to you about accessory dwelling units. I think this is an important way to add to the supply of 1 and 2 bedroom year-round housing. And then you can get into a little bit more nuts and bolts, but you don't want to be like 3 or 4 minutes into your spiel and people still not know what your position is on the issue, right? So that's why it's important in that first part to state where you are at the beginning, why you're here, what you're going to say it, be seated. It's a little bit like when we were kids and they had us do essays, and they'd be like, have a beginning, having an intro, have a body, and have a conclusion. It's just like that. So for you, and you should have all gotten an elevator speech cheat sheet. What it gives you, excuse me. One thing that's also important to do when you are giving a speech or having a conversation is also identifying yourself. I'm a young professional. I'm a 14th generation Cape Codder. I'm a fisherman. So that it's showing that you are connected to a broader constituency. Again, getting that idea that it's more than just me who's concerned about my personal stake in the world. I'm connected to others. Using that one-line preview, I am supportive of this. I'm opposed to this because framing it using the talking points and personal stories can be very impactful. One story that we show when we do these longer trainings is a young woman who spoke in Chatham at a planning board meeting on ADUs, who was being displaced by her landlord, who had decided, I'm going to make more money renting seasonally. So she couldn't find anything in Chatham, and she was having to leave, but she was still there. She was still there showing up, and she was saying, I'm exactly the type of person you want in your community. That stuff like this will help me. So.
What is the economic difference between year-round rental and seasonal rental?
It depends. So if you're on the water, you're going to make a boatload more money seasonally. If you are, on the backbone spine of the Cape in a, working class neighborhood, you're not going to make quite as much. And we ran some numbers. David, do you want to jump in here?
Yes, I would just say that we found that very few people are able to cover the cost of the carrying cost of their property through a summer rental. Very, very small amount. Right. So and then in terms of pricing, kind of whatever you could make per week in a summer rental is about in general what you could make per month as a year-round rental. So every property is a little different. We did find when we looked at some back-end data from Airbnb, we were surprised to see such a high vacancy rate in a lot of areas. Peak season, so August 2018, there was a lot of properties that were vacant 25% of the time, even though they were trying to rent them out weekly. And that's actually what started us to get on this, to look into this Rent 365 idea. We were thinking maybe there's people out there that are really trying to rent, but the market's getting saturated. So I think that is starting to happen. So and with the short-term rental tax, we might start to see more and more people think about how they could use their properties differently.
Yeah, so just to give you one really concrete example, and then we need to move on. I just spoke with a property owner in Harwich last week who makes $100,000 in 10 weeks in the summer, and he has a winter rental for 10 months where he makes $33,000. What's the incentive there?
Yeah, so it depends on the location, and it also depends on what some of the carrying costs are. Okay, so getting back to making your elevator speech, I'm not going to read this verbatim, but basically, like I said, it's sort of setting up that intro, that preview, using the talking points or the framing that you've gotten from organizers like myself or Andrea or David. if you can, weaving in any, addressing any false information, and then closing out, just reiterating your point. Again, this is why this is important. And then it always helps, these are volunteers, it always helps to thank them. A lot of them are getting yelled at left and right. I know no one who's upset when they get thanked. So, sure. Oh my goodness. You can be more effective as a homeowner. You would absolutely be, the question was, can you still be effective as a homeowner? Absolutely, because you can say, I pay taxes in this town. I have a financial stake in this town. Property owners, in a lot of ways, sometimes I don't want to say this as a general statement, but for many, property owners carry more value. So you can say, this was me 10 years ago, or I have a lot of friends who are dealing with this circumstance. I'm a homeowner, and I support creating more rental housing.
And I personally lived in winter rentals, and we bought our home through the USDA loan development loan.
Yeah.
I understand, I definitely want to support.
So you are absolutely poised to do so. Now, how and when can you do that? The decision-making process at the local level generally it's a long and winding road. So if you sign up as an advocate, you may be contacted at various points along the sort of legislative process. Doesn't mean you have to engage in all of them. You can engage at just one point. If you have never shown up at a public meeting or you've never written your local elected official and you do that one time, that is 100% more, okay? And that is important because we need that. So I'll just sort of start backwards. The legislative authority in most towns is town meeting, meaning you. The registered voters in the town go in to a school auditorium and they vote on the budget, they vote on zoning changes. In Barnstable, it's the town council, and in Falmouth, it's elected town meeting members. So a little bit different in those two towns, but every other town on the Cape is town meeting you. So that's why it is so important for the younger people to show up and advocate at town meeting. But before that, it starts off with just as a proposal. Somebody's got an idea. It could come from you. It could come from within the town staff. It could come from a member of the planning board. And then it goes through public meetings in which they have some basic discussion about it. They fine tune it. In Chatham with this accessory dwelling bylaw, the planning board was looking at it for well over a year. I think they had 5 or 6 meetings. And so, yes, the legislative authority, the town meeting vote is super, super important, and the public hearing is super, super important. But all this stuff going on in here is where the sausage gets made. So what the final product is that has a public hearing, that could be more watered down if we're not engaging earlier. Because NIMBYs who have the time to engage in the process have a tried and true tactic of showing up and basically pecking to death a proposal and watering it down as much as can be. So that's why we need to be there to push back against that. But then there is a public hearing. Again, really important to hear from people who live or work in the town. There might be some final changes, but other than that, it's going to, Board of Selectmen, FinCom for review, but then it goes on the warrant, and then you get a chance to speak at town meeting. It's more people than in this room. It can be a little bit intimidating. So what I always like to acknowledge, the basics of the elevator speech, you are free to take a copy of that. If you sign the email sheet, we will email you an electronic copy of that elevator speech cheat sheet. I encourage people to actually read from it if they're not comfortable just speaking off the cuff. But if you're getting nervous, you're not the only one. And I've seen people speak at public meetings for years, and some of the best will just take a moment. Who here practices some form of meditation or mindfulness? Okay, so maybe like a third of the room. So regardless of whether or not you do, it can be a little intimidating. You might feel, for me, I get red. So I'll just take a moment sometimes and just look down at my notes and just take a moment to just breathe in through my stomach, my diaphragm, and just breathe in and breathe out. For you, it may seem like an eternity. For everyone else, it's just a second, okay? And that can make all the difference when it gets to, when it comes to saying what you came to say effectively. But, so David said how important it is for us to be bringing our friends and going to town meeting. That being said, it can be long. It can go for hours. Some towns it can go multiple nights. So come with a plan. You know, CCYP, some of the founders of CCYP, like Lynn Mason Small a few years ago, started something called Bring a Buddy to Town Meeting. You know, we've tried to encourage that. Make a plan. I mean, I remember when a bunch of us all lived in Dennis, you know, we would get together for dinner beforehand, and we'd sit together as a group. I think Mel Sanderson brought our knitting needles. But we would go back and forth, and we'd be able to text back and forth. Sometimes I'll bring, at public hearings, I'll bring my laptop and do work. Another thing is if you're going to a public meeting, for example, I wouldn't say this for town meeting, but if you're going to a public hearing, you can look at where the issue is on the agenda and then follow it along at home. And when it's getting close to it, hop in your car, head down to town hall if you want to skip over that first part. And the other piece is get your hand up right away, because you know the opponents are gonna. So you need to be engaging in that, and also if you don't want to wait too long. So that's how to directly engage. And what we've talked about, this has been a very small training in terms of what we've been doing. Some of our other trainings go on several years. Not several years. It feels like that. Several hours. But so we're just giving you a little bit of a snippet of how to engage when it comes to direct advocacy of asking local elected and appointed officials to support or oppose something or to make some changes to something. But there are other ways that you can also help out through the Cape Housing Institute, through Smarter Cape. One of them is to, like I said, organize and bring your friends, bring a block of young people to town meeting. You can be a huge game changer. Calling voters to persuade them to support, for example, accessory dwelling units. That is something that we're actually doing ahead of this town meeting season. You could do that. You could sign up for that. Handing out leaflets at town meeting, letters to the editor, all these things can make a real difference. So I want to close out with what are some things you can do right now today before you leave this building. So David has handed out, I believe, a handout version of this. But I have mentioned accessory dwelling units because it's a very perennial, it's a green issue right now. Smarter Housing for Cape Codders, buildasmartercape.com website. If you haven't already, sign up as a supporter. Sign up that you are willing to help make phone calls or to write letters to the editor or what have you, so that we know that we can count on you. Because if we're going to change who shows up and how they vote and have a positive impact, we need you all to be part of the process. We need it to be more inclusive. We mentioned before, Future Cape Cod has an open letter asking selectmen and town council members in all 15 towns to adopt a model bylaw that we developed, asking them to put their short-term rental money towards long-term investments like housing and wastewater. You can sign that open letter on that website. This is, I think, an important one, particularly because there's a town meeting session coming up in the third breakout. And so I'd encourage you to do that either prior to that or during that. Make a plan. I think they'll have handouts there of when all of the town meetings are. But put it on your calendar, like physically put it in your calendar today. Maybe make a Facebook group and say, hey, invite all of your friends who live in that town. Post it on social media. Use the hashtags. Make it something that is fun for people to go to and that they want to go together. Most people don't go because they don't really know how it works and it's a little overwhelming and they don't want to do it by themselves. even if you don't completely know what you're doing, if you're not doing it by yourself, it's going to be a lot better. You can check out our report, and there's also one-pagers on that as well. And then I encourage you, when the Cape Housing Institute has future advocacy trainings that go into more depth than this, we haven't set up the schedule for next year yet, or we might do something in the fall, we don't know. But I would encourage you to just sign up on the website now so that they have your information, so they can let you know. So all these things are really easy, low-hanging fruit. All right.
Can I just say 2 things about this? Number 5, go to that institute. Everybody that I know that's been to it has really enjoyed it and got something out of it. And do sign that letter for the future Cape Cod. We have that in Provincetown where we dedicate our funds into these pots. Been doing it for several years. And it's just like was said, the money comes off the top. No one pays any attention to it, and it goes to incredible worthy priorities of the town. This is really great stuff.
Thank you. Right.
Hi, I want to kind of double up on the gentleman from Provincetown's comments too. So I serve on Barnstable Town Council. Just out of curiosity, is anyone here from the town of Barnstable? All right, so you guys have a slightly different model that you're working with, and the nice thing about town council is that it meets twice a month. So there are a lot of opportunities to share your concerns, your voice, your vote at town council. And there's opportunities at every meeting, there's public comment that you can go up and voice what your concerns and your desires are. So I would really encourage you to reach out to your counselors, your select boards. They do listen, they do care. Serve on committees is also a great way to engage and direct the conversation. I mean, the reality is the future of the Cape does not sit with people like me. I'm over 50, all right? I am not the future of the Cape, you are. And if you want the Cape to become what you need it to be, to have the housing supply, to have sustainable economic development, to have opportunities for your children and your families, then you need to be the ones driving the train. So we need you to run for committees. We need you to run for office. Join select boards and council.
But don't feel overwhelmed. Again, if you do one thing, that's still 100% better, Evan.
I want to just make one comment about town meeting, and if you have intentions of going to support particularly zoning articles that would influence housing development in your towns. And I want to highlight a unique situation that happened at a recent Mashpee town meeting. And this is specific to the rules of how a town meeting works through the moderator, and this might come up during town meeting. But when you're dealing with a contentious zoning article that's specific to housing, and it passes, right? You're there to support this article, and it passes, and you're all excited, but then you leave.
Yes, thank you.
You can make a motion if you're a NIMBY individual to take a recount, and if a zoning article needs to pass by a 2/3 vote. So if that recount is allowed by the moderator, and a recount happens, and you've left, and now you've gone below your 2/3 threshold, your support has then just walked out the door. So see your issues through to the end of town meeting.
Absolutely.
After 30.
Lisa.
Just want to say thank you. I think this work is really incredible. It's good to have smart kids in front of the room. And just to see the momentum in this direction. The second is, I think we also have to talk about appropriateness of housing. So, people need different kinds of housing, just needs to go up. And I guess I'll ring my bell that I've been talking about for a decade, which is, what about tiny houses and granny pots?
Thank you.
So, thinking about how do we use that football field of a property in a different kind of way, not just through that use.
Definitely.
Yeah, you were creative. I just wanted to add a sixth thing to your list, actually, to add a sixth thing. There is tremendous career opportunity in housing. There isn't a career track where you go to school and learn about housing and you become a housing specialist. I'm brand new to this work. It's been 2 years, and now I'm advising towns across the Lower Cape. So I've been talking to lots of housing consultants across Massachusetts who are kind of like the only ones that are being recycled across the entire state. They can't do it all. And there's definitely a recognition that there's opportunity here. So it's an interdisciplinary field. You can get at it in lots of different ways, planning, community development, but do consider it because I think there's a lot of potential there and it's fun.
Yes. And I would say though, I'm all for the tiny houses, but right now so we've got 5 town meetings considering accessory dwelling units. Eastham, Harwich, Chatham, Dennis, and Yarmouth. In at least a couple of those towns, there is some really strong opposition, claiming that it's going to be duplexes and drug dens. It's just not true. So if we can't get ADUs passed, we certainly can't get tiny homes passed. So from a strategic perspective, we need to go for the most basic, easy thing first, get that done, and then go in stages and go after some of these other types of approaches to smaller units, which is what we need. In the back.
I'm from Falmouth, and we have actually 2 articles in our town meeting to amend our new accessory apartment bylaw to make it more accessible to the public.
Yes.
If you prefer. And my question is for this gentleman from Provincetown. I find it kind of disappointing that you said that you only have 3 units so far. Is that because of the relative newness of it and the bureaucratic inertia? And it just seems kind of disappointing, especially with the median age in this county. You would think the age in place factor would.
And I'm gonna ask you to just keep it quick because we're gonna have to wrap up.
Well, answer that and then what?
No, I think accessory dwelling is an awesome idea. The challenge you have is you have a market demand by people, and yes, everybody has a relative who may need some housing. The challenge is, are the people who are going to actually build them, do they want them? So I think it's more productive in a median market where there's probably $350,000, something like that, people who are buying into it, and they don't have really enough money to support their home, and they need extra cash income. But when you reach the outer Cape, and the income levels reach the levels they are, and the property values reach the levels they are, the folks who have that money don't need to have a supported unit in their property. We have a lot of property owners who literally rent year round for only one reason, because they care. They don't make money on it. But every time the property flips and it goes to a second homeowner or someone who doesn't care, and sometimes they do care, but a lot of times they don't. So that the challenge is not for us. We have it basically as of right. We actually provide a tax incentive. We're doing everything we can, but ours is an issue of market value of the properties and who actually would be the market suppliers. Well.
So I want to thank everyone so much for your participation and rapt attention. I don't think I saw anybody fall asleep, so that's awesome. So you're free to go. I do want to just ask that those 5 steps that you can take, that you make a commitment to do that by the close of business today. All right? Thanks, guys. Let's engage Cape Cod. Thank you.